Consciousness, one of the toughest things in the universe to understand. You've got this brain, and we've started to understand that, but the idea of consciousness, that eludes us. So I want to take you on a thought journey with me. We know, for example, that people that go under general anesthesia, completely knocked out, they have no idea of time passing. They have no idea of a world. They're completely knocked out. So if I were to take a really long nap, right, I'd wake up and I'd feel like, I'm maybe a little out of it, but I would know time has passed. I would know things had happened while I was asleep. But people who undergo general anesthesia wake up as if no time had passed. So consciousness, this idea of being alert and aware, is a fascinating thing to talk about, because without consciousness, as we see here, there is no world. Without consciousness, there is no self. So understanding consciousness is one of the most important scientific things we can discover. Let's get started. So let's start with some definitions. What is consciousness? So very simply, consciousness is awareness of existence. This is one definition we commonly use. I exist, I'm aware of it, therefore I have consciousness. Someone in general anesthesia, like we talked about earlier, or a coma, they're not aware that they exist. One of my favorite definitions is of the philosopher Nagel. And his definition is, consciousness is something that it is like to be that creature, right? So as a human, it is like something to be a human, right? I'm a human, so it's like something to be me. His example was a bat, right? A bat, if it was a conscious, there would be something like it was to be a bat. So you could take that down any road you want. But consciousness is something that it is like to be that creature. Another definition that might help you is the state of being awake and aware of one's surroundings. That's another commonly used idea of consciousness. So let's take some of these ideas and let's go a little farther. If you're thinking about the properties of consciousness, all right, I gave you some definitions, but think about the properties. I'd like to divide it into two. First, consciousness gives us an experience of the world, right? As I'm recording this video, I'm seeing my screen, I'm seeing a light, I'm seeing my pen. If you're out on the street, right, you might feel warmth from the sun. You might smell food cooking in a restaurant, right? All these sights, sounds, and smells essentially are part of our conscious being. We understand them, we see them, we smell them. That's our experience of the world. That's part of consciousness. But even more interesting to me is that another property of consciousness is that we have an experience of ourself, right? Like no one else knows what it's like to be Brandon, to be me. So this experience of being you or me is what I think of as the second property, the consciousness of, or the experience of our conscious self, right? We're the lead role in the movie of our lives, right? So we experience the world, but we also experience ourselves. We have this internal dialogue going of what it means to be yourself, okay? So I want you to remember these two properties of consciousness: experience of the world, experience of ourself. Now, we also want to talk a little bit about levels of consciousness. I'm kind of tackling the easy things first here, you've probably noticed. Levels of consciousness, if you think about, I want you to look at this graph, and this is a great graph. On the bottom, we've got content of consciousness. So in other words, what's the contents of what you're experiencing? Over on the y-axis, we've got the level of consciousness, right? What's your wakefulness or arousal state? So if we think about down here at the bottom. If you're in a coma, there is no content of your consciousness, and your level, your wakefulness, is very low. Then you move up, right, to general anesthesia, like I mentioned earlier. Still, you have no idea of the passing of time. You're not having any content in your consciousness, and your wakefulness or arousalness is still really low. Then you go up a little bit. When we're dreaming, when we're sleeping, we do have some contents, and we are a little more awake than being in a coma. Moving up to light sleep, drowsiness, and then you get to the top. This is our conscious experience that we know as our daily living. Right now, I'm conscious. Hopefully, you're conscious watching this video. These up here are kind of interesting because you can be awake, for example, right, and be in a vegetative state, meaning, right, folks that are in what we call a persistent vegetative state that are hooked up on machines, right? They're awake, but their brain doesn't have, their consciousness doesn't have any content. And you can see these up here as well as we move on. But this hopefully gives you an understanding that there are many different levels of consciousness that we want to talk about. I'm going to focus in a lot on this, right? What we think of as our conscious experience in our daily lives, being awake, having content, I'm experiencing the world around me, and I'm experiencing myself. Okay, so philosophers have long thought about consciousness and this idea of a mind-brain problem. So if you think about the mind and the brain, some people think that's the same thing, but the brain we sort of think of as this sort of physical thing that we can see and touch. Mind is a little harder, right? Can you see your mind? Can you touch it? Is the mind a thing? So philosophers have really argued about this for generations. A lot of it started with Descartes and his idea of dualism, right? His idea was that at least some aspect of consciousness lies outside the physical. So if you think physical brain, that would be the physical material that we see. He proposed that consciousness was outside of the physical. This mind, if you will, is outside. Now, he didn't call it the mind and the brain. He had different states that he used, and he used some Latin terms to describe it. We won't go into all that detail. But you could sort of think dualism too, right? There's a physical and a non-physical that make up consciousness. Then the sort of contrary opinion to that is materialism or physicalism, meaning there is only the physical. There is only the brain, and there's no other sort of weird dimension thing happening, no soul, spirit kind of mind that's happening. And you can sort of look at this little chart I put here, right? So dualism, the Cartesian or Descartes duality, is that mind and physical matter, mind, those are different, and they are fundamental. Now, over here, physicalism, as you see, what I just talked about, matter greater than mind. So the physical, as you see, because it has a solid line, that's fundamental to us. And then the physicalism says that the mind is derived, or is a derivative of the physical brain. Okay? Some other more sort of common or more recent, not common, but recent ideas about this is the quantum mind theory. And these are physicists mostly, maybe some neuroscientists, that argue that our mind cannot be understood by classical mechanics and physics, the laws that govern us that we know, and instead it's about quantum, right? Beyond that atom, deeper into these particles, these things maybe we don't understand. And they go as far as to mention entanglement and superposition. Now, I will tell you, this theory doesn't have a lot of evidence for it, but there are some people that find it quite interesting. And then I want to mention, we're talking about the mind-brain problem. Well, in circles of consciousness experts, they have something called the hard problem, right? Like, this is the big hard problem of consciousness. And that's the idea that there is a mental state that derives from physical matter. How do we get this state from physical matter? And to sort of exemplify that, there's commonly thought of as this problem. Well, what about vision, right? It makes logical sense that one person might have an inverted color vision than another person, right? That could logically make sense. And how does this happen? Well, it must arrive from the physical brain. But if this were to happen, and yet we all experience the world together, how do we get a conscious experience from a physical thing? Okay? And a lot of scientists and philosophers really argue about that problem. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about perception and consciousness, because this is a really interesting thing to consider, what we perceive. Okay, so think about perception when you perceive something. Well, there's a problem. Your brain, right, has evolved over time to be locked in the skull, right? If I look at I can't even see the brain. It's locked in the skull. It's tight. Now, that's evolutionary, right? It's to protect the brain, the very important thing. But your brain is you. You are your brain. So for you to experience the world around you through this thick bone, you've got to rely on information. Where does that information come from? Well, it comes in the form of waves, right? Light waves, sound waves, chemical interpretations of smell. So at its core, your brain is really making its best guess as to what is outside the skull, okay? Because the brain's not seeing it. There are things connected to it, but the brain's making its best guess. Well, what do we know, if you're a scientist, hopefully you are, about making our best guess? Sometimes it's not right? So I want to give you an illusion. If you look at box A and box B, take a look at those for a second. Are those different colors? Think about that. Is A, box A, and B different? Actually, notice that I'm going to put up a little line here that's the same color. If you notice, these are A and B are actually the same color. What? Well, your brain has sort of played a trick on you. Your brain is making its best guess as to what's going on. Why does it do that? Well, if you saw the sort of green cylinder here, it looks like it's casting a shadow. And in our minds have learned over time, our consciousness has learned that when there's a shadow cast, something's darker. Well, so if the shadow is cast here, that's making it darker, so it must have originally been lighter. Okay? So what this kind of leads us to is this idea that perception, what we perceive, see, smell, hear, is perhaps more of an interpretation from the brain than the actual pure sensory information that we get from the surrounding areas, right? And tons of illusions would lead us to think that. So then one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite conscious scientists or cognitive scientists is this quote right here. The world we see perhaps comes more from the inside going out than the outside going in. Meaning our brain, the inside, is projecting more of what's truly around us than our senses are interpreting correctly what is around us. Okay? Fascinating. Then this same cognitive scientist would go on to talk about hallucinations. Hallucinations, when you think of, right, people that are on drugs, or they hallucinate, or maybe someone with schizophrenia. But let's think about at the root what a hallucination is, right? So if I'm in a room and I see a purple elephant, nobody else sees it. Well, really what that meant was I was hallucinating. I perceived something that was uncontrolled. I had a perception of something that no one else perhaps saw, or that wasn't the result of true sensory information from my eyes. So that would be an uncontrolled perception. That's what a hallucination is. Well, then some cognitive scientists would go a step beyond that and say that then our perceptions, what we see, what we smell, what we hear, is really a controlled hallucination. Okay? So some scientists would argue that consciousness is just hallucinations. What's some evidence of that? Okay, take some example of these silhouettes over here. Okay, you've got a silhouette that's there. In your mind, before you even look over here, you could probably in your mind reconstruct any of these chairs from this silhouette you saw here, right? So your brain fills in the gaps. Same thing, you saw this random image. You could probably in your brain get to that, right? Oh, that's a car, I see it, I'm in my brain, I'm gonna interpret this as a car. Maybe it wasn't, maybe it was some weird like little cell or amoeba. But you interpreted it there. Why? Your brain did the interpretation for you. Based on limited knowledge that we had, your brain constructed. Now, why does this happen? Well, we know evolutionarily speaking, these controlled hallucinations evolved to keep us alive. If I saw something like that, I need to quickly make a decision. Oh, that's a chair. If I saw something like this, oh, that's not something that's going to hurt me, that's a car. So these controlled hallucinations help to keep us alive, but maybe the hallucinations over time became what is our consciousness. So the idea of consciousness as hallucination is a really interesting thing to think about. And again, one of my favorite scientists here, Anil Seth, says, when we agree about our hallucinations, right? Because we're all experiencing hallucinations, but when we agree about them, that's reality. When someone has a hallucination that we don't agree about, right? That's a psychological disorder. So what's the neuroscience? Okay, now we're going to get to the hard stuff. Well, if you think about how is consciousness constructed? Well, a lot in the field, if you think about it, okay, we're going to use some terms, a term, the neural correlates of consciousness. Let me explain what that means. Okay, so here's the outside world. You're perceiving, whether that's correct or not. You perceive, you smell, you hear. Inside the brain, it needs to construct a few things for you. We call all of these constructions in these neurons the neural correlates of consciousness. It's the minimum set of events that would be sufficient to give us some conscious precept or perception. So here is, right, we see a dog. The brain's got to do some fancy work for us to, in my mind, somewhere on this visuospatial sketch pad in my brain or mind, I see a conscious precept of a dog. So that makes sense. That's logical, right? What's the hard part, though? This. So what are these? What's really going on to give us consciousness, for us to see, for us to smell or hear something? Well, we need to talk about neurons before we can talk about what's really going on in the brain. So, you've got sensory neurons, right? I see, I smell, I hear. Then those receive information, send them down this long axon, and then there are other neurons, which we might say are in between or interneurons. Then if I needed some reaction, right, I might have a motor neuron attached. Okay, if I saw a snake, oh, see it, interpret it, oh, move. I need to get my muscles to move. I need to get away from that snake, okay? So neurons are the basis of our brain. Well, if our brain is also responsible for consciousness, these neurons must be responsible for consciousness as well. So the question then becomes, how do our billions of neurons give rise to consciousness? Okay? Well, I wish I had the answer. I'm going to give you some thoughts, but, this is one of the biggest mysteries still in the world. So, we do think we have a few ideas about where it happens, right? Where's the physical location of consciousness happening in the brain? Well, we know that the thalamus, midbrain, and pons have to be functioning for a person to be in a sufficient state of arousal to experience anything. And we know that because if we look at people that have brain damage, and if these areas of the brain are damaged, then they do not have enough arousal to experience anything at all. So, For people that have a damaged brain, if they can't experience, then we can sort of take it a step further and say, well, the thalamus, midbrain, and pons must then have some sort of role in consciousness. Then we also know, as I just was talking about, the content of that consciousness, right? Okay, I'm a conscious being, but there's also some content going on, right? Right now, you're watching a video. That's some content that you're seeing. The content of our consciousness is probably linked to the cerebral cortex, right, that you see there, and the thalamus, which is central, okay? So notice these sort of basic parts of consciousness are deep in the brain, which makes us think that perhaps other organisms might also be conscious. But some of the experiencing things, the content, is maybe from some of these outer and then links to the thalamus, that control center in the center of the brain. Okay, so maybe there's a few places. Some scientists are then taking it a step farther to say, well, how is this really created? Is consciousness just in the neurons? Is it a property of neurons? So I want to go over a few things that are properties of neurons. One is action potential, and you've probably learned this in your biology class, that action potential, this electrical signal that goes down neurons, is what transfers information down a neuron, right? So there's your neuron. If you got a little zap of electricity, right, this action potential moves down a neuron off to the next neuron. So that's a property. Many scientists are looking into this action potential. Is this what creates consciousness? Some scientists take it a step further and they say, okay, well, we've got this electrical signal, this action potential, but what do we know about electrical signals and action potential? They often create electromagnetic fields. So here's your neuron, and if you've got this electrical potential, there's also going to be this electromagnetic field around it. And some cognitive scientists are saying, okay, well, consciousness then is here, maybe in this field, because there's more properties than just sort of the physical that's around it, okay? So some scientists might think that. Others are looking into this spike, right? So when a sensory information is received, right, I see something, it creates a spike, as you've sort of seen this, right? Our membrane potential, which was at rest, then spikes because, I experienced a certain threshold, I saw something, I smelled something, and the spike actually carries more information about the stimulus than just electricity. So some scientists are thinking it's all about these spikes, okay? What do I think? Well, it's hard, right? This is a really hard problem. Maybe it's a combination of all of these. Maybe it's really, really tricky and it lies beyond something that we can understand at this point. So here's a really interesting topic that I find fascinating. And when we're talking about consciousness, right, that's, again, our awareness that we're awake or what it's like to be me. A question that comes up is, are decisions made by your brain before you are consciously aware of that decision? In other words, did the brain make the decision and then let you in on it? Okay, well, actually, it's crazy, but it's true. Many studies show that brain activity indicates what a person will choose, or their decision, even before they are consciously aware of it. And a lot of these studies look at the area of the posterior parietal cortex, which seems to encode a person's intentions, right? And what we find is that the part of the brain that seems to be making the decision, actually, that happens before you're consciously aware of the decision that's been made. So they did some studies, and this was at Caltech, a person using a brain-computer interface, right, to play a piano, right? So they're not actually pushing any keys. The brain is hooked up to a machine that's interpreting what they want to do and then is playing those keys on the piano. So the brain, believe it or not, seems to be making the decision before you're consciously aware of it. Well, then you can get into semantics and say, well, I am my brain, right? So I'm making my decision. Or are you not your brain? Are you some level beyond? Is your consciousness not the brain, as we talked about in some of those theories early on. Fascinating. Okay, what does this sort of lead to? Maybe another philosophical point for you? Well, if the brains really make the decision before you do, before your conscious self does, what's that say about free will? Did you really make that decision? Did your conscious self make that decision? Or did the brain make the decision? Which is you or is not you, right? It's all crazy. Okay, another thing that I often get asked is, what about other beings, animals? Are they conscious? Well, we do a lot of study, and perhaps you've heard a lot about cephalopods and the octopus here. Are they conscious? Well, again, one of that famous scientist I was talking about, Neil, he has a quote which is really interesting to me. Consciousness and intelligence are different, right? You may look at this and say, oh, they're not that smart, right? They don't possibly have human intelligence. True, right? Nothing else that we know of has human intelligence. But consciousness and intelligence are different things. Different. In other words, you don't have to be smart to suffer or experience or to have a conscious experience, right? There are some people that are not so smart that still do these things. And if you think about it, animals, it seems if you strike one and they have pain, I'm not saying you should do that, right? They seem to be suffering. There's some experience. You don't have to be smart to suffer, but you have to be alive, right? So maybe there is consciousness in some of these other beings. A few studies have been done. Some scientists are arguing that the gray parrot has near human-like levels of consciousness. Interesting to figure out. Birds can be very intelligent, but we would never say they're as intelligent as us, but maybe they don't have to be conscious. One of the ways that we often sort of test for consciousness is the mirror test. Do other organisms, are they able to identify self in a mirror? And some animals are. Actually, the gray parrot did not, so it wouldn't have passed this mirror test in some of the studies. But is this necessarily a great test? So this idea, are other beings conscious, is tricky. Personally, I think there are some, right? I think there are definitely some other animals that it is like something to be them, right? If you go back to Nagel's definition, it's like something to be an octopus. There is some experience that an octopus has that nobody else has, okay? As we start to wrap things up, we talked about consciousness, general consciousness, but I want to now talk about some altered states, right? Like I did with levels, these are some states that are altered. So sometimes there's a pathological issue, right? So think a brain injury or someone that has epilepsy. That alters someone's consciousness. So it's an altered state. We see people with epilepsy or severe brain damage that they have different consciousness states. They see things, they hear things, they maybe smell things that really aren't there. Of course, you probably are aware, not that you do this, but there are a lot of people who take psychedelic drugs to have a pharmacological altered state of consciousness. Psilocybin, which is one that's studied a lot, basically it affects parts of the prefrontal cortex. And these people that take this psychedelic drug, find it completely alters their state of consciousness. Many would say that it takes you back to sort of an early state of consciousness where there's enlightenment and you can learn about yourself. Now, I'm in no way telling you should do that, but you should know that those studies exist, and some people who study consciousness also study the effect made by pharmacological drugs. And then another altered state of consciousness would be psychological. So people who undergo intense meditation or hypnosis, this has been known to alter states of consciousness. Okay? So I want to finalize here with just to get a little philosophical for you. I want you to think back to some of the illusions we talked about early on. And I think I gave a case that perhaps we can misperceive our world. So remember the two aspects of consciousness. The aspect of the properties. Seeing our world and seeing ourself. Well, just as we can misperceive the world, as I've shown you in some illusions and here, right? Over here in this one, you probably see a triangle there. Well, there's actually no triangle there. Your brain's constructing that. If you look over here, if you look at these lines, it kind of looks like this line up here is longer than this one, but when we put up the red line, you would notice that they're actually the same. So my point here is for you to consider this. Just as we can misperceive our world, our consciousness is taking its best guess at what is outside of this skull, perhaps also then we can misperceive ourselves. And so if we're not even great at perceiving the physical world outside us, maybe we're not so great at perceiving ourselves. And maybe we should just give ourselves a darn break here and there, because we're being too hard on ourselves and we're misperceiving ourselves, when in actuality, maybe it's just a misperception and we're not quite as bad, or we're better than we think we are.